Have you ever wondered what the right key to your horse's mouth is? Have you ever gone into a tack room and seen rows and rows of snaffles? How thick a bit should you have? Should it be an egg butt? Should it be a French link? Should it be a cheek snaffle? What's the right size for your horse's mouth? So many questions, it's really hard to get the answer. It's hard to find the bit that actually fits your horse. Today you're going to see a variety of bits and you're going to know a little bit more about what suits your horse. With a bit of understanding, your relationship with your partner is going to grow and blossom. Let's have a look at the structure of a horse's mouth that we can begin to understand where are the points that we need to consider to see if your bit does actually fit or not. We all know to look from the outside and to see a couple of wrinkles on the side of the corners of the mouth and the lips here, and we think that's enough, right? It's one of the points, but come a little closer and see if we can look inside the horse's mouth. Right, be careful if you do this at home that you don't get your fingers cut. If you gently put your finger in on the corners of the mouth, you'll see your horse will open his mouth. My hand is resting on the bars of the horse's mouth, and that's between the front teeth, the incisors, and the back teeth here, the molars that grind the teeth. This is the part of the mouth that our bit's going to rest on, so I need to make sure that there's enough room here. I want to check that perhaps there might be a small wolf tooth in front of the molars that's going to bang against our bit. So by checking to make sure that there are no additional teeth in front of our molars here, and so this horse is fine. If there is a problem, then your veterinary surgeon will come once a year and check the teeth and make sure that they are smooth and that there's no wolf teeth. Let's have a look inside this horse's mouth. What I'm looking at here inside his mouth is I'm looking at the roof of his mouth, and I'm looking at the thickness of his tongue. The roof of the mouth is fairly high, so that's going to give enough room for a variety of bits. His tongue is not particularly thick, so there's going to be room for a bit to rest comfortably in his mouth. This is quite good for some of your more advanced competition horses because it's going to give room for two bits, the bradoon and the curb bit, which is sometimes a bit of a mouthful for horses. So what did we look at here? We looked at the width of his mouth, and this horse has actually got quite a narrow mouth. Right? We looked inside his mouth, very important when we check our bits in a moment. We're also looking at the inside of the corners, inside of the lips here. And I always like to check with the horse. I'm just running my finger in here, and his mouth is very smooth here. Right? If there's a lot of thickness or perhaps some scar tissue, I would need to make sure the bit was not too thick, but was comfortable enough. So perhaps a thinner egg butt would be better for a horse like that. Remember that if you're buying a loose ring snaffle, you want the loose ring snaffle to be very slightly larger than your egg butt snaffle to allow for this movement on the side that you don't actually nip the inside of the lips or the corners of your horse's mouth. With any bitting problem, remember that when the horse is in pain, if the bit doesn't fit and he's hurting, he is very likely to run away. Simplest way of putting our bridle on is to rest the bit along your first finger and put your thumb, as I showed you earlier, inside the horse's mouth. Don't force him, but very gently ask him to open his mouth, and as he does so, run your right hand up the side of his face, and the bit will slide easily and comfortably in and rest on the bars of his mouth. It's very important when you're putting your bridle on or untacking that you don't bang against the back of the horse's front teeth, because then he'll not really like being bridled in the first place. How does this bit fit? I've got a couple of wrinkles here at the side of his mouth. Right, but I want to look, remember what we said earlier on, I want to look inside his mouth and just see where the bit is lying on his tongue. Let's have a look here, see what we can see. The first thing is he's not fighting the bit, he's not chewing the bit, he's not unhappy with it, he's not trying to maneuver it in his mouth to make himself more comfortable. He seems to be quietly accepting the bit in his mouth. Remember, if our horse doesn't accept the bit, something is wrong. It might be his teeth, it might be the bit. If you think it's his teeth, have your veterinary surgeon come and check. If you think it's the bit, have your trainer check with you. We're going to look at the corner of the mouth. You can see there's a little wrinkle here, which is good. But let's look inside the mouth as well. I wonder if he'll let us open his mouth yet again. So we'll open his mouth very gently, and the bit is not resting too low down on his tongue. So he's not going to be likely to get his tongue over the back of the bit here. It's just wide enough to fit both edges of his mouth. We'll have a look in a moment at a loose ring snaffle, and you'll see that the loose ring can be a little wider. You can take the bit slightly out to the side and just see where the actual centre joint, nutcracker joint, rests on his tongue. If the bit is too thick or too thin, it would perhaps either cut or tear the sides of his mouth. Let's put our noseband on and we'll get an idea of our finished bridle. You can see that he's happy with the bridle. He's not fussing against. So hopefully when I ride him, he will accept my rein contact, he'll take my hand forward, and I'll be able to give my small aids to make me safe and successful in the show ring. So here we have our horse ready to roll, and his friend has come along to say goodbye. I hope that helps you see how to fit a simple egg butt snaffle. Let's have another look at a bridle. Here we have a totally different bit. This is a loose ring snaffle, and I like to always check the loose ring just on the soft skin of my hand here, and I move the bit around and just see if it catches my skin. And this bit actually does catch the side of my skin here, so would perhaps be the wrong bit. But let's see if we can have a look and see if it actually fits this horse. You see he's not very happy? Let's try and adjust it up a little bit and see if we can make it fit. Let's have a look and see if this bit actually fits him. We've raised the cheek pieces up, so from the outside it looks like we now have the bit fitting. But I wonder what it looks like inside. Shall we have a look if I turn him a little bit? Gently put my finger in. You'll see that this bit is lying much lower down on his tongue. So when I ride him, he'd be continuously trying to pull the bit up in his mouth. If I persist to ride him with the bit that's a little bit too long in his mouth or a little bit too low down on his tongue, I risk him getting his tongue over the bit, which would be very uncomfortable, and he'd be likely to run. So this bit is too long inside the horse's mouth. Can you see? If I look inside his mouth, he's not nearly so comfortable. The other thing that I don't like about this bit on the horse is the rings here are fairly small and they're actually catching on the lips. Can you see that? So although you may firstly look at the outside and say, oh yes, this does, it's fine, this bit does not fit this horse. All right, it's very likely to nip the side of this very soft skin around the corners of his mouth, and it's definitely too long inside his mouth. He'd be very likely to get his tongue over the back of the bit. Careful. Let him give the bit to you. Here we now have a 16-2 Trakehner stallion. Now, a lot of people think that the bigger the horse, the bigger the bit. The smaller the horse, the smaller the bit. But that's actually not true. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm going to have a look at this horse's mouth. And you can see the first thing from the outside is that he's really short from the corner of his mouth forwards. Can you see how short his mouth is? And then from the front, how narrow he is? He's not going to be a horse that you need a great big wide bit in. It's going to be something fairly narrow. What else can I see from the outside? Well, the next thing that I'm drawn to is the thickness of the corners of his mouth and lips. You can see that the corners are actually raised and fairly wrinkled. So the danger of this horse getting pinched around the corners of his mouth is going to be fairly high. Can you see how tender that skin would be? And any horse that gets nipped by the bit is going to certainly not relax onto the contact, perhaps get frightened and run away. But in whatever he does, it's going to make him difficult to steer and control. When I look inside his mouth, you can see how fleshy his lips are. It's hard to actually see the roof of the mouth as well, but from where I'm standing I can see that the roof of his mouth is very low down. There's not going to be an awful lot of room for a bit, and then you can see his tongue really fills up most of his mouth. Now what that does is tells me that the thickness of the mouthpiece has to be such that he can comfortably get his lips closed around the bit and be totally relaxed. But I am concerned that we have another problem in the thickness of the corners of his mouth here. If you run your finger around the inside here, be very careful he doesn't bite down against your fingers. I can feel a lot of hard tissue, almost as though at some stage he's had some bits in his mouth that have been a little bit too rough and have caused some scar tissue. All of these factors are going to determine what's going to be the right bit for this horse. Let's have a look at this bridle and see. This is a loose ring snaffle. What I always do to start with is the width of the bit, or the thickness of the bit, is I think probably going to be quite nice for this horse. The rings are small, but the chances of the loose ring perhaps pinching against the corners of his mouth is going to be fairly high, so I'm going to have to watch out to make sure that it actually fits. Some people ride all their horses in loose rings or all their horses in egg butts. You really need to make sure that the bit fits each particular horse. Check that your bit is clean. If there's old food stuck on the bit, that can cause scratching and be very uncomfortable for the horse. In the loose ring, you can see here it's a nutcracker action. I also check that center ring. You can find sometimes that they become worn and very sharp, which is obviously going to cut the horse's tongue or the roof of his mouth. This bit is fine. It's smooth and comfortable in the middle, so would be safe to actually ride in. And then I measure the bridle against the horse's face, and the rings of the bit should be where they would be if the bit was actually on the horse. It's much easier to make an adjustment up or down prior to putting your bridle actually on. When I fit the bridle onto the horse, I'll lay the bit against my left hand and put my thumb into his mouth, and then gently raise the bridle on his face, put his ears in, sort out his forelock, and if I'm checking the bridle, I like to take the noseband out of the way so that I can actually fit the bridle on the outside, and what most people forget is to actually have a look inside the horse's mouth as well. What do we see here? From the outside, He seems to be quite happy with the bit where it is in his mouth. It's perhaps a little on the low side. There's barely a wrinkle there. Can you see that? There's room on either side, but although the rings are a little bit narrow, as the rein is used, you might end up with him being pinched on the opposite side, but it does seem to be reasonably comfortable, and it is sliding round without catching against the inside of that very tender part of his lips. But I wonder what the bit is going to look like inside the horse's mouth as well. Let's have a little look inside. As soon as I put my fingers in, can you see where the bit is? Look how the tongue is being rolled back all the time, and how easy it would be for the horse to get his tongue over the bit. Once a horse learns to get his tongue over the bit, your steering and control is very suspect. Any of you who've ridden a horse who's been inclined to have his tongue over the bit, it is not a pleasant experience. If I raise the cheek pieces up a hole on either side, perhaps that'll make a difference. Let's have a look and see what happens now. I like the height of the bit now. There's a little bit more of a wrinkle on the side of his mouth. Can you see that? It's still not pulling back too much, but as I open his mouth to check inside, we still have the same problem. Just because the bit has been raised on the outside, it doesn't help the inside fit. It actually can make it worse, because that center joint is now falling further down on his tongue, with an even greater risk of him getting his tongue over the bit. So, what do we think? This bit does not fit this horse. We have it adjusted as high as we can to be comfortable from the outside, but when you go to the inside, you'll see that the bit is too long and does not actually fit this horse's mouth. We need a bit that's shorter so that the horse is comfortable and that he'll stretch forwards and take the bit comfortably from the rider. I would like to see this horse in perhaps an egg butt, which might eliminate the problem of him getting pinched on the sides of his mouth, or a D snaffle, which might help turning, or perhaps one of the hanging snaffles, which would give you some pole action as well. This loose ring snaffle is too long and does not actually fit this horse. So when you fitted your bridle, make sure that you check the bridle on the inside as well as on the outside before you attach your noseband, because it could appear that from the outside that this bit was a perfect fit for the horse. The mouthpiece is not too wide. He can comfortably get his mouth closed around the bit. It appears as though there's enough room that he's not going to get pinched on the side of his mouth. And you might wonder why your training program wasn't as successful. It's simply the bit is too long inside this horse's mouth for you to make any successful progress in your training program. We'll have a look at this horse later on in some other bits and see if we can find something that would be more suitable for him. So when you come into your tack room, you'll see an array of bits on the wall, and it's very hard to know which is exactly the right bit for your horse. Let's think back to our 16-2 stallion that we were looking at, and he was unhappy with the loose ring bit. So I've picked 3 different bits down from the wall here to have a think about them before we go any further. The first one I've picked out is a simple straight bar snaffle. It's an egg butt which should be fairly flexible on the side, but I find this bit gives you very little riding feel because there's no joint, there's no movement to the bit in the horse's mouth. So I would say this bit would be a no. But perhaps he might like to go in either of these bits. There's a D-ring snaffle or an egg butt snaffle. And I would have looked at these two bits. The D-ring, you can see, is a very fat bit on either side. It's quite short in the mouthpiece. But what do you think about this thickness of bit inside our horse's mouth? I would say no, it's too thick. Remember, if the bit doesn't fit comfortably inside the horse's mouth, resting comfortably on his tongue and giving enough room for the roof of his mouth, he's not going to find it easy to stay relaxed and keep his mouth happily closed around the bit. So again, I think this bit would be slightly too thick for him. Here we have a D snaffle. It's very small. It's perhaps a little bit too small for that horse, but you can see that it's fairly thin on the sides here, and yet the D is going to be smooth against the corners of his mouth. Perhaps it would be worth trying a D snaffle on him or a thinner egg butt. Let's see what else we have on the wall that might work. We have some other bits. It's a bit like trying to find a pair of shoes to fit it, doesn't it? But it's, you know, it's worth spending the time experimenting with different bits to see what actually fits. Again, we're only talking snaffles. Let's compare our two egg butts. This is very small. It's only a 4 1/4, which would be a pony bit, but it's much thinner on the edges than our other egg butts. So here we have two egg butt snaffles, but very different in the shape of the inside of the bit to fit our horse's mouth. I was asked about a French link, or something with a plate in the centre. The difficulty with the long plate here, like the Dr. Bristol, is that because the horse has a fairly thick tongue, fairly thick bars and some damaged scar tissue on the inside of his lips, you may find that this outer edge actually pinches his tongue against the bars of his mouth. So although we don't have the nutcracker action, we have more play with this bit, which is very nice. It may just be a little bit too long, this plate, for that particular horse. Another bit that we looked at here was the twisted snaffle. It's thicker at the side. It's quite a slow twist on it, so it's not a particularly severe twisted snaffle. But with a twist at all, it is going to rub against the bars of the mouth, so it would be a more severe bit than our regular egg butt snaffle. We've taken a shorter link, a smaller link in the centre of this bit, and if you can see from the side, this link is curved a little bit and is going to give a little bit of pressure on the roof of the mouth, particularly if the roof of the mouth is very low, and is going to give quite a lot of room for the horse's tongue. So this bit might be quite a nice bit in our horse's mouth in that it's fairly short, it's not going to catch him on the inside here, there's room for his tongue, and there's going to be a little bit of action on the roof of his mouth. So this one would be one that I would suggest keeping. The last of the snaffle families that I really like is what's called a hanging snaffle. And I've used this bit myself on horses going cross-country. I like it because the mouthpiece is not too thick, there's room for the horse's tongue, it's a very simple bit inside the horse's mouth, there's no pain or there's no pain caused by this bit, but because the cheek pieces are attached to these hooks, what happens as you give a rein aid, you actually get a little bit of pull pressure. And I can remember the first time I used this bit was on a horse going cross-country, and he was fairly fast cross-country, and I needed him to be able to take a half halt and slow down quickly enough after a fence without losing any time. So I put this bit in, and I can remember him coming down off a bank, giving one half halt on this rein, him immediately coming back and being able to continue on a rolling stride to a coffin. So it was a very smooth round with no fight. Let's have a little look at her mouth and see if we can find out if the bit is comfortable for her. Firstly, from the outside, if you look at the horse's mouth, you'll see that this horse's mouth is actually longer than the stallion we looked at. This horse is 15.3, the other horse was 16.2. She has a longer mouth, and I'm going to see if she'll let me put my hand into her mouth. It's quite hard to see into her mouth, but you can hopefully, in that bit there, see that the roof of her mouth is fairly high. There appears to be plenty room for a bit in her mouth, but I wonder what the bars of her mouth, the thickness of her tongue is going to be like. Let's have one more look at the bars, see what we can see before we actually fit the bridle onto her. Be careful when you're doing this, because it's very easy for the horse to either bang you on the head or catch your finger. So I always like to put my hand round onto the front of their face and stand in really close, then I'm fairly safe. Watch your fingers. Good girl. Good girl. So she hasn't got a particularly thick tongue. Her teeth are, you know, a nice shape. There doesn't seem to be any problems in her mouth. The bars are fairly soft, and there's no thickening or damage to the inside of the corners of her mouth. So let's have a look now and see if this bit actually fits her. Be very careful and gentle as you put the bit into your horse's mouth. Allow them to take the bit from you. Give them a little bit of time, because there's nothing worse than jamming the bit into the horse's mouth and then wondering why you develop a bidding problem with her. I like to do up the throat lash, but not do up the noseband to start off with, partly because I'm going to give her a chance to see and relax with the bit, but also I want to see what things are like from the inside as well as from the outside. From the outside, she looks happy with this bit. There's enough room on the mouthpiece of the bit before the ring that you can see that the ring is going to slide around and is not going to catch the corners of her mouth. So you can see how the ring is going to, as I use the rein, the ring is going to move, and it's not going to catch on that very tender corners of her mouth. So this bit appears to be a good size for this horse from the outside. Remember that you want your loose ring bit to be a little bit larger than your egg butt. But as we've discovered with some of the other horses, it's important to look down into the bit and see what's happening inside the horse's mouth as well. So from the outside, she looks good. She appears to be quite happy. But as I use the rein in a nutcracker action, remember that the nutcracker of the bit as I use the rein is going to push forwards, and this might catch either a tongue or the roof of the mouth. If the mouthpiece is too long and I pull on one side of the bit, you'll see that the bit pulls through her mouth, and that might mean that the joint in the center is going to catch her tongue against the inside of the bars of the mouth. So let's see if we can have a little look inside and see what she's thinking about this bit. Good girl. So the bit is lying fairly low. You see how as she plays with the bit, she can actually get her tongue over this bit. Can you see that? So this bit is actually fractionally too long inside the horse's mouth. Let's look again. See how easy it is for her to bring her tongue up over the bit. Now, if she did get her tongue over the bit, we would have real problems in our steering. I wonder what happens if we raise the bridle one hole. What do you think? All right, I've only taken up the one side, but already you can see she's almost smiling too much. It's pulling the bit too high in her mouth, which you may think from the outside is good, but it's actually taking the joint of the bit even lower down. So it's quite interesting when you actually look at how a bit actually functions inside our horse's mouth. Let's put this back down. Can you see she's more settled with the bit now? So this is the right position for this bit on this horse's mouth. We'd need to see how she goes in a loose ring. Remember that if we decide that the loose ring isn't exactly the right bit for her, and we decide to go to an egg butt, we would have to go down a size. Remember also that when you have a bridle for a period of time, it can stretch. So make sure that you always check your bridle, make sure that it's still fitting, and make any adjustments that you feel are necessary. Here we have another horse to look at in the fit of the bridle. This is a little Arab stallion. He's about 14-2 hands. And we talked earlier on about the problem sometimes with Arabs of them having a fairly thick tongue because they carried water or stored water in their tongue. And it means then that you sometimes can have a bit of difficulty getting a bit to fit comfortably in his mouth. So if we have a look in his mouth, and let's see if he does have the nice Arab thick tongue. I'm looking at the inside of the lips, and they're quite thick but smooth. There's not the scar tissue damage that we saw on the other horse. But if you look inside, you'll see he has a very thick tongue. Can you see that the roof of his mouth is almost coming down below his teeth? See how thick his lips are here. Good boy. He must wonder what I'm doing. But it's so important to actually look inside and really know your horse. Shall we see if our bridle fits? Yeah. This is a different type of bridle. This bridle is used for endurance riding and is a halter bridle, but it is actually his own bridle, but we're going to measure it against his mouth, and it seems to be the right size for him. All right, so if we look first of all, you can see this horse is comfortable with his bridle. He's not chewing the bit. He's quite relaxed about the bit, but I wonder what it's like inside his mouth. Looking from the outside, you can see that there is just the right amount of room here. Right, it's wrinkling the side of his mouth ever so slightly, but it's not pulling up. This would be too high. You can see the bit it's pulled up, it's making the horse almost smile too much. Okay, but I wonder if it fits inside. So if we gently open his mouth and have a look, you'll see that the bit rests in almost a straight line across. It's comfortable. The bit is not dropping down too low, and because it's a fairly narrow bit, it actually fits very comfortably inside this Arab's mouth. What would happen if we made it all too high? You could see the bit would come up here. Can you see that this would be too high? And the horse would not be comfortable. If the bit was dropped down lower, it might bang against the tush teeth here. But you can see that there's room for the bit to lie, he's got room for his tongue, there's room for the top of his mouth, and this bit is going to be a comfortable fit. on him. So here we are back again with our 16-2 Trakehner horse. We've chosen a bit that is much smaller, and it's a French link with a curve on the side. It should be comfortable on the inside of the lips, which were fairly thick, and it should have that little bit of play in the centre. It's not the nutcracker action, and this might just be a key to this horse's mouth. Let's see if it works. We've already measured the bit against the side of his face and made approximate adjustments to see if it fits. Okay, firstly, looking from the outside, there are no wrinkles on the side of his mouth at all, but it looks to be a comfortable width in his mouth. Isn't that surprising that a 16-2 and a 14-2 fit exactly the same size of bit? Let's have a wonder what it's like inside if we've made it a little bit too low for him and if he has room. You can see the thick tongue, but the bit is resting comfortably in his mouth. I'm going to adjust it up just one hole. And I would say here, this one hole up is a little too high. You can see how he's now chewing on the bit. He's just not quite so comfortable. And again, he's stiller. Looking from the front, you can see the side there. This bit actually fits this horse nicely. So I would like to see how this horse goes, whether he actually relaxes and steps forward into the contact and moves in a better way with a bit that would be more comfortable in his mouth. It's fascinating. The bit that fitted 14-2 is exactly the same size as a bit for a 16-2. So you never can tell until you've checked your horse's mouth to see how wide the mouth is, how much room there is in the actual mouth, where their tongue is, where the bit is actually resting, and where the bit is actually going to come into play. So thank you very much for being so cooperative. We'll now let you off into the sunset to relax and enjoy your evening at grass. The time that you spend finding the right bit is time well spent.
Oh, knight in armor, are you coming back? Lead us on into the fray. Oh, knight in armor, are you coming back? Lead us on into that victory day.
Confidence comes if you are successful at what you do. All right? So I want to dwell tonight on how you would structure your confidence. Be comfortable enough to listen to your horse, listen to yourself, listen to your trainer, and be willing to make changes.